Thank you, Bob. And I really want to thank Ida and Bob for being the local organizers. You know, it's an enormous amount of work putting something like this together. And if Ida wasn't so talented, we'd be not quite where we are today. You know, I really enjoyed Dolph's presentation, but there was some good news. All this activity, all these things coming together. But if you're a young scholar in the room, did you notice the proliferation of journals and the proliferation of papers? Now, why is this doing that? Am I all right now? Maybe I was doing something over here. And that means that your job is getting harder and harder and harder, keeping up with the literature, which is just really enormous. So what I'm going to talk about now is a new intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, it's really important. I think it's going to bring many new opportunities to everyone in this room in the years ahead. But I'd like to know, why has it taken us so long to do the obvious? What were the impediments to progress? Well, first you have to know how to, we live in a world of acronyms in the science policy realm, and you've got to know how to pronounce the acronym. Is it IPBES? Is it IPBES? Is it IPBES? I was at one meeting where one of the delegates, she said in her one sentence, she used all three pronunciations just to make sure that she didn't offend anyone. Well, you won't offend me if you use IPBES. Okay, I want to trace back why it's taken us so damn long. What are the words that are on paper that provide an impediment to progress? And I'm going to contrast this with the progress made in the climate science area with what's made in the biodiversity area. The contrast. So I'm asking you to look closely at words put on paper, which become documents, which then everyone has to pay attention to, and you can't make progress if the words aren't right unless you get around those words. Now, the Climate Convention was 1992. As you all know, we just celebrated 20 years after its signing. And that convention actually had a target in it. The objective is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level to prevent dangerous, kind of a fuzzy word there, anthropogenic, how do we know that's going to happen, interference with the climate system. But it's a real target, even though there was a lot of discussion about that through time. So there was a target, it was a bit vague, and you know the history of all of that. So before the Climate Convention was agreed upon, there was a science assessment before the convention, and so that the actual document outlining it, the establishment of the Climate Convention, was based on science. So what was going on in the biodiversity realm? The sister convention, same year, Rio 1992, the big year. That's when many heads of state actually came together and talked about these things. There was no science assessment prior to the drafting of the Biodiversity Convention, although there was an ad hoc science committee leading into it. So the objectives of the convention are fairly vague. Objectives are conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from genetic resources. The last thing became the tail that wagged the whole dog in the early years of that. So, and what was the guts? I mean, what was going to happen? Each contracting party was going to do as far as possible and as appropriate. It wasn't, you know, we have a concentration of gas we got to reduce, and people are causing it, and we know what we have to do. This was very vague. Several years after that, that convention was agreed upon, actually I asked one of the prime negotiators, wouldn't it be nice if we had a science assessment base for the CBD as it was for the climate convention? And he said, no, the convention is not about science, but it's about values. And that's an interesting statement, actually, when you think about it retrospectively. But science was not part of the key driving force, at least in his mind. Now, I'll get to the heart of the matter here in terms of why we've had so much difficulty in having some progress here. Is that the convention, of course, serves at the behest of governments. Governments have to come together, and the CBD formed a science advisory committee called the SubStem, but it's not an independent body as was in IPCC. It served under the convention at the under the power of the nations, and so it's the Science Advisory Committee for the convention was initially populated by lawyers because the main issue was protection of property rights, a national issue. So the subject had gotten much better in recent times, but it had a very bad start here. So Bob Watson said, you know, he's the king of assessments. He's been involved in every assessment we've ever done, from ozone on biodiversity and climate and so forth. So he initiated an independent biodiversity assessment outside of the CBD through the sponsorship of UNEP. It's pretty exciting. 1,500 scientists did their best to put all the material together, the information, and this was then presented to the CBD. This is what they said. We didn't ask for it, we don't want it, and if you produce it, we won't use it. Now why in the hell they say that? Well, we worked hard. We worked really hard. Well, it all goes back to the problems that we're having in international agreements today, and that's Article 3, the sovereignty, which is in the charter of the UN document, of the whole UN, that nations have sovereignty over these decisions. So producing this report that they didn't ask for took it away from nations having a say in it, and they didn't like that. So we're not going to use it. So we tried again, another approach, and that is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, incorporating a new dimension and better political base. To get the political base in the beginning so then it could be used by the governments we accepted. And so trying to learn from the past failure, looking at the IPCC, the mantra is for a successful assessment has to have political legitimacy, that is the government's asking for it, scientific credibility, and of course on target for the topic. Well, the MA tried to do that by indirectly having a multi-stakeholder board which involved all of the conventions and all of the UN agencies and so forth, plus business leaders and ministers and heavy industry, and so it was really a pretty hefty board. And was it a success, the MA? Well, I think very much so in terms of institutional structures and research programs and where we are today, promoting innovation, but it didn't have still a direct link to the governments. The governments didn't approve it. This was a multi-stakeholder board which we involved them, but they didn't call for it. And you can just sort of see all the things that have come from it. I mean, including in this country, a committee which advises the president in 2011 noted this nation lacks a careful accounting of the services provided by ecosystems and the condition of many environments that support these ecosystems. As a result, our committee to the President says the federal government institute and fund a quadrennial ecosystem services trend assessment. Now that's a big step forward, and how that will happen, we'll see. That was to one administration. We'll see what happens when in November or January. So how can we do better? Still, the MA stimulated a lot of activity, and I think has brought us, contributed enormously to where we are today. It resonated with many agencies and governments, and things were done, but still it didn't have that government buy-in internationally, and that's what the next step. So the meeting, this is 2005. It's now 2011, right? 12. No, it's actually 12. What year is it? 12. I lost track 10 years ago. President Chirac of the French government called a meeting together, and he called for a new mechanism, an IPCC-like process for biodiversity. And this call, launched, the French government took upon themselves to launch a consultation among nations, among the scientists of nations, to see whether this is feasible or not. And I have to point to some people who were sort of the heroes here that pushed this along and made it happen. One was Michel Leroux, who was the chair of the Science Organizing Committee for that Paris meeting of Chirac's, and chair of the Diversitas, which is an international program for biodiversity research. And Charles Perrin was a member of that committee. And Charles Perrin has been really key in what's happened since then. He's been a tireless supporter of the IPBES process, and he was a very important member of the PCAS committee. And many of the ideas which we think are really important, he really pushed hard to get in there. After that meeting in France, there was a paper published in Nature by Michel Leroux and Alfred Montaigne-Dubois from Mali, I believe. Biodiversity can be has more complex challenges than climate change, they argued, and so why isn't there an international panel of experts for biodiversity? Now, some more heroes. How do these things happen? Well, this guy on the left, Didier Hofschier, was with the Ministry of Research and Education for France. And he wrote the speech that Chirac gave, and he shepherded the consultation process that went on after them. And so he's my hero number one. My hero number two is Anne-Laure Gaudry, who is the executive director of Diversitas, and she was extremely helpful in this process with Didier, plus all the scientists involved. So they started this process. You've got to have a consultation. Don't worry, I got 3 hours left. Right? It says 12 minutes here. There was a meeting the consultation started. You had to go around the world. Do you really believe we need this? What do you think of it? What do you suggest? And meetings in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 consultations, and the flavor of the debate was there was some skepticism. We got all these networks, we got all these programs going. Do we need another network, another thing? And that was sort of resistance against that. But still, I think the conclusions were overwhelming that what we did have still wasn't quite adequate. In parallel, what was happening with the French initiative, there was an MA, through UNEP, there was an MA follow-up initiative. And they held a meeting in Stockholm with 20 interested partners to see whether to go ahead with this MA2. And the result of that, these two meetings, two parallel processes, it was stated we can't have two, we can only have one. And so they got together in Montpellier and merged these two efforts and started the process of doing that. And now we're getting to what the beginnings of what's going to happen in this new thing. And the results of this meeting to bring together MA follow-up and IMOSEB, as the French initiative was called, was 5 different lines. You see, it's going to be quite different than the climate convention, very different. What was being suggested for point A actually never happened. Influence the science agenda directly by having a big science program. But the next items did come through in the end, as you'll see, generating knowledge, new knowledge, policy support, interacting with the policy community, horizon scanning, what's on the horizon. That was a big battle and won, but in a different form, and capacity building, a big issue. Now, at the beginning of the next phase, Michel Baptiste from UNESCO in 1975 said something which is actually kind of true. For those with no experience in the intricacies of international cooperation, this slow movement is thoroughly frustrating. For those aware of the problems, there's always a pleasant surprise when some little bit of progress is made. So as the years go by now, we start out in 2005, now it's now the IPBES is initiating the ad hoc committees to sort of test it out some more. If we go 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, starting the consultations, 2009, 2010. These are ad hoc. And then the final plenaries. Okay, there's the first one. And you start seeing now the flavor of the conflicts and the problems. Brazil, the central thrust of the IPBES should be capacity building. They were really strong on it. The European Union, IPBES should be independent of substance, the science. And Brazil wanted to link it to the Biodiversity Convention. The US said it shouldn't be linked to the convention, but should be part of all the environmental conventions. And many thought that it was still premature to have such a thing. China said it was too early. And then the most important part of all, would the IPBES, if formed, be a governmental body only or a multi-stakeholder? A single government or multi-stakeholder? So in order to move forward, the ad hoc meeting said, gee, we need more information. Do we really need this? Again, coming back with this argument, do we really need it? So a big gap analysis was done by UNEP. And the lessons learned from the science community. Boy, getting science in these discussions is really difficult. It's nice when it happens, but it's really hard. And we learned that the negotiators that sit in these meetings have an enormous pain threshold. And the straight line between 2 points is not observed very often. Now, Madame Albright, who's been involved in a lot of these, she said, you know, in UN negotiations, participants often forget it's about deal making rather than rhetoric. Well, actually, the reverse happened in the biodiversity thing. People were making deals, but not the big global issue. We got a real problem out there with biodiversity and the loss of services, but it was more on the deal making, and the deal making, because it's nationally run, the deal is between nations. I'll give you this if you give me that. They'll bid $10 million, well, I'll give you 10, and so the deal is made. So what's the science community doing? Well, time is passing very slowly for those scientists involved in the session. And this next picture I'm going to show you is really sad. What happens to a good scientist involved in this debate? Can you believe that? Can you believe that? Ananta Duriappa, who's very important in the MA, sat through those. I sat through that. You know, I used to have jet black hair, just last year actually. And when the going got tough in these negotiations, there was always a relief there. You can go to the prayer room. Well, as one lesson we learned from the first meeting is that there weren't very many scientists involved in the political part of the process, and so how to do that. And we wrote a paper in Nature calling upon the scientists to try to get involved in the process. And now some of the national committees negotiating sessions. Here's one from the U.S. where you can see two really very good government scientists in the background and now part of the delegation, and that's the team, a lawyer, a negotiator, and two scientists in the back, a young lady learning the ropes. Those of you from Israel, there was the head of delegation was actually a scientist, Uriel Safriel, a very distinguished ecologist. But most of the delegations were people who didn't know what assessments were, didn't know much about biodiversity, and so it was an uphill battle. Okay, the second meeting was in Nairobi, and the first meeting was in Putrajaya in Malaysia. So now finally there was a buy-in, there's a broad agreement for a need for an IPBES. Discussions went further, reasonable hope that things would move on. But boy, some of those delegates were really tough. This was a negotiator from Brazil, a very talented diplomat, too talented for the crowd, and he just sort of blew over everyone. And he wanted two things. The capacity building had to be the big thing. And he got his Minister for the Environment to have a television presentation. If you guys don't sign on this, we're walking out. And the second thing he wanted was that CBD would be part, and the IPBES would be part of the CBD directly, Conventional Biological Diversity, being controlled by those governments. He won on the first one and lost on the second. He's now ambassador to Portugal for Brazil. So the outcome of Nairobi, now honing in on what the things, what components of the program are going to be, and an agreement to move 1/3 meeting to get a final agreement. And this is what's finally agreed upon. This is in Busan, a meeting in Busan, Korea, the last meeting. So there's going to be 4 components. This is very unlike the the Climate Convention. It's going to be policy support, directly working, what do the policymakers need and what can we provide to them? And there'll be capacity building, overarching everything, assessments, which is the IPCC model, catalyzing knowledge generation, new knowledge coming from the gaps in the assessment. And so the program is now set, and the principles are in line, scientifically independent. This is what we didn't have early on for biodiversity. Policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. You've heard that before. And then also, which is really crucial, it's going to be regional up rather than global. It's not going to be global in the start. It's going to be more regional, local, and that's a huge difference. Developing country involvement and respect for indigenous knowledge, multidisciplinary. Okay, so there was an agreement. People jumped up and down. But there was one big loss, and that is that the meeting did not approve of a stakeholder involvement. There'll be stakeholder involvement, but they couldn't vote. So there'll be NGOs and everything there at the meeting, but they can't vote. So we lost that battle, and jumping for joy from the actual Busan meeting where things were approved. Okay, this is the second and last set. I think I'm going to skipped the first session. This is now actually a plenary. It's been approved, and now the government's operational. And here's the resolution. We, the representatives of governments listed here on, so forth and so forth, on this occasion, decide to establish an independent intergovernmental body to be known as IPBES. Now this meeting, this almost did not happen. Any of you know Jose Saracán? Jose Saracán is a head of Canabio in Mexico, is former president of the University of Mexico, very distinguished ecologist and hero. He, at the last minute, there was a lack of an agreement to move forward. And Bob Watson raised his gavel and said, if we don't have an agreement on this particular issue, I'm going to pound down the gavel, and 7 years of work would be lost. And Jose put up his hand and he suggested a way to get around the little dilemma. It's not an issue which is solved, but it got us through that. And this is, will this be hooked with up to the UN or not? And he suggested a way of changing the voting would be by majority and so forth, rather than consensus. So the decision is made. It's going to be jointly hosted by FAO, UNEP, UNDP, UNESCO, not like the Climate Convention, which was only UNEP and WMO. Physical location of the Secretary is going to be in Bonn, and there are still issues that have to be solved. And these are issues which are haunting us as we go on in this ecosystem service area. Bolivia is very concerned, as we all are, this commercialization of nature and the valuation stuff, and so they said they couldn't sign on. They wanted to have ecosystem services. The benefits are derived from ecosystem services, not the benefits to society, but the benefits to all organisms, all creatures. And so the delegates agreed to a multidisciplinary expert panel rather than a multidisciplinary science panel to bring in traditional knowledge and so forth. The nature of the regional representation will be the 5 UN regions rather than top-down, global. And there are other things which were decided on. So where are we now? What's next? What can you do? Well, there's now an intersessional process, which is a call for the community, the policy community, the science community, to have input to the final decisions. So what are the big decisions? Who's going to run this damn thing in terms of people? Who are the people we're going to have? Who are the officers and the members of these the platform? The new platform is an expert science panel as well as a bureau. And how will the bureau and the panel operate together? The bureau is the plenary is all the nations. The bureau is a subset of those nations who are serving as executive. So they're asking for you to suggest to your government delegations, your governments, your suggestions for who should be on these things. And they're inviting submissions by governments on capacity building needs and activities, views on other sorts of things. So it's really, the call is out. And they're also, the interim secretariat is hosted by UNEP. UNEP was asked in that final meeting in Montpellier, would they do the interim secretariat, but they're not the permanent secretariat. And there's a great debate now about who should be the secretariat. But the interim one is still with our great friend Neville Ash, who was very, very crucial in the MA. He's serving as chair of that. And they're preparing a draft conceptual framework and a background document and so forth. So it's been a very long ride. But we now have a mechanism of serious commitment, enabling the science community to really enter in this in a big way and do the kinds of things that Bob Costanza was talking about. How do we get integration? How do we get things coming together? And the one thing you can say about the IPCC, it has done that in spades. brought the community together, thinking about these issues, looking at all the literature, and say, what do we learn from all this? What's the take-home lessons? And we've lacked that in the biodiversity area, in the ecosystem service area. So we have a new pathway also interacting indirectly with the global policy community, from the regional to the global, and hopefully more to the local. So I'm really quite hopeful that we're going to be at a new plateau that we haven't been before. But enormous amounts of disappointments, an enormous amount of wasted time, but that's where we are. And our community made it all happen. Because remember, it started with the science community. It started with Diversitas and Chiracs coming together and making this proposal, and built on the scientists saying, we need this. And I think we have this now, and we just have to make the most of it. And I want to thank these kind of people here. And in that last picture, some of you know those people. They've been very important in the ecosystem service realm. So thank you very much.